Hello, and Merry Christmas early. Today, we're going to talk about something sad in the history of England. We're going to look at History of England, episode 22, A Family Quarrel Divides England. Now, last time, we looked at the early part of the reign of Henry VI, and how, because he was a baby when his father died, the control of England was taken over by a regency council, each man having certain powers, each man wanting more power personally. And while this argument of control was happening, Henry was growing up and he was crowned King of England and King of France, despite the 100 Years' War going totally against England. And then we talked about how many times in this latter phase of the war, England could have walked away more than they got, but they kept insisting that they were kings of France, which didn't please Charles VII, who had managed to be placed on the French throne after the victories of Joan of Arc. And I talked about how England was divided because of the power struggles and about the Jack Cade Rebellion, which has its genesis in various issues ranging from being paid to anger about the war to fierce assassination related to their fate. Finally, I talked about the various moves that Richard, Duke of York, made in order to become the power behind the throne, or had the throne itself, depending on who you asked. Now, during the late Middle Ages in England, it must be said that violence was as ordinary and as unremarkable as going to the store to pick up milk would be for us. And perhaps this is because the expression of emotion is different from our own time. People tend to be very serious. They tend to be very shrewd. But this was a hard world filled with threats. But it's also a world of humor, a world of irony, a world of resignation. It was a world where, despite the social restrictions, it was possible through marriage to move up in the world slowly, even more possible through mistakes to fall fast. People were well educated, despite what we think of today. Most people knew, for instance, at least some classical Latin, as well as reading, writing, and arithmetic. But in the world of war and domestic turmoil, the general economy of England was growing at a rapid pace. Now, since the population had been struck down in the Black Death of 1348, there was more land and more work and fewer people to live on the land and to do that work, meaning that more people were richer than in case in centuries. Now, it's a common notion, mentioned in many letters, many diaries of the time, that the common English peasant was better housed and better fed than any other peasant in Europe. The parish churches of this period were one of the most visible signs of affluence, and they can still be observed in the English landscape. Each parish rivaled others with the extent of its patronage, for this is the great age of the church tower, and the majority of the stone bridges of the country were being improved during this time. And this is also a time for further education, no matter that education was found in cathedral libraries or in the new colleges that were being built in Oxford and Cambridge and added to those universities. With schools, almshouses, hospitals being constructed throughout England, this is the time the large, unfortified country residences, where increasingly brick instead of stone was being used. Now, during this time, we also have the current Guild House of London being built, and the Guildhall in York, and Eton College, and King's College. It can be said, indeed, that as clothes fit the man, making him more than what he was, architecture in England was becoming the expression of the country, with the churches, the libraries, the guild halls, the bridges still in use today. Now, there were periods of slump. followed by periods of great economic activity in England. And there was overconfidence and anxiety, yet what we will call the gross domestic product of the country materially increased. People, mostly the middle class and upper class, were able now to afford satin and pipes of wine, razors, domestic, needles, mantles of leopard skin, playing cards stamped with the image of the Lamb of God, which must have been interesting, monkeys from Africa, cloth from Zealand, silver from Paris, coats of mail from Milan, pots from Genoa, cloth from Arius, and girdles from Germany. The Royal Navy at this time was made up of volunteer merchant ships, which plied their trade and patrolled the sea around England and defended its shores. The cities and towns of Bristol and Southampton flourished. The new affluent merchants of that town were able to sit in the House of Commons, pressing the demands for the exclusive management of what was not necessarily fair trade. Now, out from England, England was sending out to the rest of Europe wool and beer, painted glass and carpets, iron, timber, silver, charcoal. In fact, England was becoming more known for its mines than for its wool during this period. But the reign of wool reached new heights when Henry VI was ruling. It's true that the exports of wool had declined a bit from the peak in the 14th century, but this is offset by a proportionate increase in the export of woolen cloth. Taken together, wool and cloth represent 80% of all the exports going out of England. And exports went all over Europe and into Asia, and the merchants and adventurers who controlled the cloth trade were exporting approximately 60,000 rolls of cloth every year by 1499. The wool business involved everyone, it seemed. Wall wool would be taken from the sheep, handed to the village woman. They'd comb it and spin it. They'd send it to the weaver, who would weave it into the cloth. The cloth had to be given to the fuller to dye it, and then given to the shearmen to finish it. This dominance of wool is the reason that the Lord Chancellor of England, until 2005, sat on a sack of wool in the House of Lords. The towns that were involved in the cloth trade became larger and stronger, and the mills turned faster and faster and faster and faster. Wall wool was the mother of medieval England. It was the motor. It made everything tick. And as a result, more land was turned over to breed sheep, and more land was enclosed from farming, with villages being destroyed. But the prosperity of England was by no means evenly shared. It must be remembered that there was still unimaginable extremes of poverty besides the perceived affluence of certain county towns and regions. Life was still violent, remember, passionate, excitable, and that we turn to the main topic today, the War of the Roses. Now, there are signs of civil unrest, according to the native chroniclers, that darkened the air in the mid-15th century. Rains of blood were seen. It was stated that healing wells overflowed with the water. People heard strange voices calling out in fear. Now, this quarrel, known as the War of the Roses, is a family quarrel. The House of Lancaster and the House of York were cadet branches of the Plantagenet dynasty. Lancaster traced its origins from the fourth son of King Edward III, that fourth son being John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster. Now, tradition states that Henry VI wore on his coat a red rose, but this seems to be later an invention from Shakespeare. York traced its origin from the fifth son of King Edward III, Edmund, Duke of York. But they also point out that Edmund's youngest son had married the great-granddaughter of the third son, thus meaning that they should rule. It said that York wore a white rose on his standard, and that may be true, but then again, it may not be as well. But blue blood is bad blood often, And this fight among a small number of people soon spread and brought in more and more people. Not everyone was involved. Most stood on the outside looking in or simply going about the daily business, not caring who was sitting on the throne of England. Now, after Henry VI recovered from his mental illness, the Duke of York took his followers to his estate, and the Duke of Somerset came back to power. But in the spring of 1455, the Duke of York and his followers are called to attend the Great Council in Lancaster. York feared that this would be the place where he was arrested and charged with treason, so he promised to attend, and then he took his followers to London. Now, on the way, he was joined by the representatives of one of the great families of northern England. York's brother-in-law was Richard Neville, the Earl of Salisbury, and Richard Neville's nephew was also named Richard Neville, the Earl of Warwick. And because of this, I'm going to try to use their titles instead of their names. Otherwise, we'll have Richard Neville this, and Richard Neville that, and Richard Neville... Okay, anyway. Now, the Nevilles, great enemy in the north, in England, was the Percy family. You remember them? The Percys from the Henry IV saga? Now, the Percys had joined the side of Somerset. So both men came to the Duke of York, stating that they were there to remove his enemies and allow him to move in peace. Sorry, not both men. Not the Percys and the Somersets. The Nevilles came to the Duke of York. Now, at all costs, they had to maintain the fiction. They were not marching against Henry. They were marching against his counselors. Otherwise, they would be charged with treason. But York and his army faced the king's army at St. Albans, outside London, on May 22nd, 1455. There were some talks between two sides the day before the fight, but York feared that Henry was a puppet of Somerset, and so therefore he could not trust him. So at 10 in the morning, May 22nd, 1455, his army marched into town and started a series of rapid raids in its main streets and public squares. The army of York had a mission that day. They were going to look for Somerset, and they were going to look for Henry Percy, the Earl of Northumberland, and they were going to kill them. Both men were tracked down to a house they were hiding in. Both men were forced out when the house was set on fire. Both were then killed as they fled. King Henry VI, meanwhile, was wounded in the neck, although not seriously, and another 60 men were killed in the fighting, which only lasted 2 hours. Now, once this victory had been won by the Yorkists, as they came to be known, York and the Nevilles went to Henry, submitted to him, stating that they were true liegemen, never intended to hurt him. Henry said, okay, please end the fighting. They said, fine, we'll end the fighting. The next day, York escorted the king back to London. On May 27th, he presented Henry with his crown at St. Paul's Cathedral. So you might ask, who is actually in charge of the country now? Now, the forces of the king have been defeated. The king had been wounded. Order of the world turned upside down. But no one knew that this small battle, this 2-hour battle, would lead to a civil war that would continue for 30 years, provoke 7 or 8 major battles, and lead to the killing of 80 nobles of royal blood. Now, sometime after the Battle of St. Albans, Henry VI fell prey to some disease. We still don't know what he was suffering from. Some historians said he went back to the same state of confusion the last time because of the defeat, but records show that he did not withdraw completely from the world like last time. In fact, Henry even showed up to open Parliament that summer of 1455. In November of 1455, Richard, Duke of York, was named Protector of England. But Henry VI, or Margaret of Anjou, whoever you want to believe, made it clear that Henry was going to be kept informed about everything, as the royal family was afraid that York would seize the throne for himself. Now, York's had an important task. Defend the southern coast against France. Defend the northern frontier against Scotland. Protect the last remaining English settlement of Calais. Big task. To help him, he named his ally Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, as captain of Calais. But to do all that he needed to do, he needed money granted by Parliament, which proved to be as complicated and difficult as it ever had been. So, in February 1456, the king was brought to the Lords of Westminster and declared that Parliament was in recess. Now, at this point, York either resigned in anger or was made to resign as protector. Now, technically, Henry was in control of England again, but the real power was with Queen Margaret, who arranged everything behind the scenes and seemed to always have her hands in the cookie jar, as it were. Her main purpose was to safeguard the interests of their son, Prince Edward, to make sure that he took the throne after Henry died. In this task, her enemy was York. Somerset was dead, no longer could block him. So Margaret moved the king and his court to her estates around Coventry, making the castle of Kenilworth as her stronghold, setting up a base of power as an alternative to York, who still was living in London. See, the citizens of London had declared themselves to York. The Queen did not feel safe around them. The councils of the realm were divided. The course of affairs was drifting. Now, over the next 4 years, there's really no mention of Henry VI. He spent much of his time traveling through the Midlands, staying in his favorite abbeys, spending much of his time sleeping. There are no speeches by the king recorded during his time, no household being paid for him, no orders being given by him toward the prosecution of the war. There was little attempt to keep government functioning, except when it came to routine business of finance and patronage, but the Queen was really controlling those two branches. The Lancastrian court and the Yorkist lords watched each other and waited for the other side to make a move. In the winter of 1457, the court went back to Westminster, bringing with them a force of 13,000 archers. They came back because they knew that York was in control of London, and only by being in the city could they attempt to beat York in his own game. See, political life in England had always been a form of gang warfare, each side wanting the more money and the most land. So London is now full of Lancastrians and Yorkists, each side daring to make the first move. It was kind of like Romeo and Juliet, or that musical with the gangsters. I can't remember what it's called. Anyway, doesn't really matter. Okay. Now, more unrest followed that winter. While both sides were intimidating each other, a French fleet landed at Sandwich and devastated a town. It showed that the English were weak. They were thinking about the wrong enemy. The merchants of London are horrified and they're outraged, since this event showed that their maritime trade was at risk. And realizing that civil war starting in London would be the death knell of the country, both sides agreed, okay, let's talk now. And a compromise, kind of, was arranged. The families of those killed in the fighting were paid off for the loss. Money in England always been the best policy. This agreement is followed by the so-called Love Day. Not a day when people made love, but a day in which the sworn enemies held hands as they walked to St. Paul's Cathedral for a solemn service. But the love lasted about a day. The royal court refused to grant York or the Nevilles anything they asked. And in the spring of 1459, King Henry ordered his loyal nobles to gather at Lancaster and bring their armies with them, because he was going to use them. And this was followed by a great council of Coventry, and York was not invited, nor is any noble who was known to be loyal to him. In fact, at the assembly, York and his supporters were denounced as being disloyal, even though they weren't even given a chance to defend themselves. So York and Warwick called their banners to them, and they marched toward Worcester, where they held their own council. There, Richard Neville, Earl of Salisbury, decided to join them with 5,000 men, but the Queen and her army intercepted them. On the road from Newcastle on the Lyme on September 23rd, 1459, Salisbury managed to beat off the attack, the so-called Battle of Lord Heath, that's battle number 2, Battle of Lord Heath, that lasted 4 hours, claimed 2,000 men. The battlefield itself became known as Dead Men's Den, and it had come to this: Englishmen fighting Englishmen and killing each other. 2 battles, Lancaster 0, York is 2. But despite this victory, York and his allies heard there was a large royal army bearing down on them. So he retreated to Ludlow, and he established an armed camp. But York did not want to confront Henry in open battle. That would be high treason. So he sent notes to Henry II, He sent notes to Henry II, and really, since Henry II has been dead for about a couple thousand years, or a couple hundred years at that point, he didn't receive any reply. But no, he sent notes to Henry VI, but they were ignored. Now at this point, a group of Warwick's forces from Calais deserted, and knowing that they were vulnerable, York and the Nevilles fled during the night. As the sun rose on October 13th, 1459, the so-called Battle of Ludford Bridge was declared a victory for the Lancastrian side. 1 verse 2. 3 battles, if you call this a battle. The leaderless forces knelt before the king and were pardoned. York abandoned his wife and his 3 youngest children and fled back to Ireland. The Earl of Warwick and his father, the Earl of Salisbury, fled to Calais. Now, thinking that attack would come from either Calais or from Dublin, the government made their coastal defenses stronger. And while this is going on, in the spring of 1460, Warwick sailed to Dublin to hold talks with York on what their next move was going to be. It was decided now to invade England, and so that June, Warwick and Salisbury landed at Kent and began to march to London, where they were welcomed and given money. The Nevilles announced they were in England to rescue Henry from his evil counselors, and they only wished good for the king. They're not rebels. They're simply reformers. They wish to reform the workings of the law, lift the oppressions of the courtiers of the king on the countryside. Of course, this is the usual rhetoric. In fact, you probably remember it because this is what Henry IV said when he was invading England during the reign of Richard II. But it was received warmly by London and the people of southeast England. But it must be remembered that for York and Warwick, the end would only come if the Lancaster family was wiped out. Now, Warwick stayed in London for 3 days and then marched north, searching for the king's army. And he found it outside Northampton on July 10th, 1460. Before sending his army into battle, he ordered his troops to find and kill the king, and kill the king's entourage, and not to spare anyone. The Battle of Northampton, battle number 4, lasted an hour. The victory was a decisive one for the Yorkists. So now we have 1 battle versus 3. King Henry VI was captured, taken back to London, where he was essentially a puppet king now yet. Queen Margaret of Anjou and her son, the 7-year-old Prince Edward, managed to escape and were still at large. That September, York came back from London, essentially was in control of England now. No longer did he date his letters according to the years of Henry's reign. As was custom, he started to wear the arms of England on his banners. He arrived at Parliament that was meeting in Westminster, and Parliament had been called by Warwick, which is illegal, but technically Henry VI called it anyway. As trumpets sounded, York walked into the session with a drawn sword carried in front of him. He made his way to the empty throne and put his hand on it, as if he was claiming possession. Only been met by surprise and dismay by the assembled lords. So York had miscalculated how popular he was. He underestimated the loyalty of the lords to King Henry VI. Richard, Duke of York, now demanded he be installed as king, and he refused to meet with King Henry VI to ask him to abdicate because he stated it was the duty of Henry to see him, not York to see Henry. But Henry refused to see York because, hey, he goes to see York, he may be killed. The lords refused to make York king, and they passed the matter to the judiciary, who passed it right back. No one wished to perjure his oath of loyalty to the king. Henry may have been incapacitated, but Henry was still the king, and the senior nobles of his realm could not decide what to do now, so England was ruled by pretty much nobody. But there's some talks. There's always some talks. And it was decided by the lords, well, Henry, he could remain king as long as he was alive. And when he died or abdicated, whatever came first, the throne would pass to York and York's children. Now, York was 10 years older than Henry. The lords were pretty much playing a game. Let us wait and see who dies first. Henry said, okay, the proposal sounds good. He effectively disinherited his son. He stripped him of his rightful inheritance, but then again, he was not in a position to do anything else, and it's possible he was not in his right mind either. Now, Queen Margaret of Anjou had made it clear that the throne would pass to her son, and she's currently at large, running to Wales and then to Scotland, leaving the army of the king under the control of a man named Jasper Tudor, a half-brother of King Henry VI. So here we begin to talk about the Tudor family, which would come to dominate England in the next century. Now, Jasper Tudor was the fruit of the union between Catherine of Valois, the widow of King Henry V, and Owen Tudor, a junior member of the court of King Henry V. Now, much is known about Owen. Perhaps he was a bastard son of a fugitive murderer who had taken part in an uprising in Wales and then proved himself at the Battle of Agincourt and was made a member of Henry's court, and rose eventually to be a taster of Queen Catherine's food. And after King Henry V died, they fell in love. Now, it's possible that Owen married the widow queen after she became pregnant with a child who was named Edmund. Edmund would become the father of King Henry VII. In this way, the child was declared legitimate, but this is not proven one way or the other. Anyway, by late 1460, Margaret of Anjou came back to the north of England, having persuaded the great lords of that region to support her against London and southeast England. As York and Salisbury marched north against her, she mustered an army of 10,000. On December 30th, 1460, the two sides met outside Wakefield in what became known as the Battle of Wakefield, battle number 5. And the battle was a decisive victory for the Lancastrian side, 2-3. Only 200 members of the Lancaster army died. Anywhere from 700 to 2,500 of the Yorkist faction was killed. Among the dead, Richard, Duke of York, who was wounded and thrown off his horse, and then after being captured, given a quick show trial and beheaded. Now, during the battle, the second son of York, Edmund, Earl Rutland, was killed. And also among the dead was Richard Neville, Earl Salisbury, who escaped the battlefield and was found that night, captured, and beheaded by a mob. So after the battle, the three heads of York, Rutland, and Salisbury were displayed over the gates of York, with York's head bearing a paper crown that said, "Let York overlook York." It seemed that the war was over. Margaret of Anjou, the victor, would enact succession and ensure succession for her son, Prince Edward, once King Henry VI shuffled off the mortal coil. But Henry was still in London, still controlled by Warwick, who had not marched north, but stayed behind to run the administration at Westminster. And also, because of the agreement between York and the king, the new heir to the throne became the eldest son of York, a man named Edward of March. So now there are two young Edwards, Prince Edward, 7 years old, and Edward of March, 18, the leaders of each side. Now Edward of March had already gone on the offensive, marching an army to prevent Jasper Tudor from meeting the rest of the Lancaster army in the north. So now the new Duke of York met Jasper in early February 1461 at a place known as Mortimers Cross near the border of Wales, and there either on February 2nd or February 3rd, 1461, the Battle of Mortimers Crosses fought. What were you, Battle number 5, Battle number 6? Anyway, it doesn't matter. Now before the battle was joined, a sign appeared in the heavens. Small ice crystals formed a second sun. The manifestation of these two suns showed that some great change is going to happen in the world now. Two sons fighting for the throne. Two sons, two kings of England. The battle was won by Edward, Duke of York. So now we have what? So that's battle number 6, I think. So 2-4. Okay. I'm a betting man. I'm going to bet on York's side here. And though Jasper Tudor managed to flee, his father Owen was not so lucky. He was captured, taken to the block, quickly beheaded. His head was taken to a local town where it said that some mad woman combed his hair and washed the blood from his face. Now Queen Margaret was marching toward London. She thought she had won. The Tudors could not join her, but that's no matter, she figured. In fact, as the army marched south, she allowed it to pillage and plunder the lands that belonged to York's enemy. Stupid! She's making more enemies as she goes along. But to keep her from entering London, Warwick mustered his army and took the king with his army as a form of insurance. He hoped that Margaret would not dare to attack an army that held the king. The two sides met at St. Albans again. The Second Battle of St. Albans, battle number 7, fought on February 17th, 1461. This time the Lancastrian side won. They rescued the king, who was said to be laughing and singing a mile away under a tree while the York's lords were captured and executed. Warwick escaped with 6,000 troops. The deal was not yet sealed. Now King Henry was so overjoyed to see his wife and son that he knighted his young son on the spot, who then went around and knighted 30 of his friends. Which must have been interesting, a 37-year-old with a sword. Anyway, Margaret, with the king, marched to London, where the shops quickly closed. No one dared leave home. No one dared be caught in the streets, so fearful of her vengeance. But hope was not lost, however, for Edward, Duke of York, was marching toward London, and he met up with Warwick and his army outside Oxfordshire. They had a purpose now: occupy London, declare Edward king come hell or high water. The citizens were ready to accept them. And so they shut the gates of the city against Margaret Andrew and her army. And Edward arrived in London, where the citizens declared that King Henry VI abdicated the throne by violating the agreement where York was to be king after him when he knighted his young son. So on March 4th, 1461, Edward, Duke of York, marched into Westminster Abbey, and he was crowned King Edward IV, ending the Lancaster dynasty. Edward was 19 and stood at 6 foot 4 inches, every inch a proper king. But technically, Henry VI was still king. He had not died, he had not abdicated. So again, 2 sons, 2 kings of England to choose from. One of them had to be taken out. So King Henry IV marched his army out of London and met Lancaster army at Towton in Yorkshire. The Battle of Towton was fought, battle number 7. The royal army had been fleeing toward York, the city of York, not Edward, Duke of York, to wait out events, but did not make it in time. The Battle of Towton on March 29th, 1461, held during a snowstorm, involved about 50,000 soldiers. A fourth of them died. Decisive victory for the Yorkist faction, 2-5. Most of the Lancastrian nobility were killed. The royal family fled to Scotland. The first part of the War of the Roses was over. So next time in History of England, we will look at the second and last part of the War of the Roses and examine the first part of the reign of King Edward IV. It's an exciting one, my friends, so stay tuned, my friends. Stay tuned.